Bob Freeman is the executive director of the New York State Committee on Open Government. And Bob, these emails that I'm sure you might be well aware of, that the no hospital downtown people foiled, really didn't develop anything when it comes to any smoking gun on the hospital project, but it's opened up a whole new can of worms when it comes to some personal comments that were made in these emails. Is that just part of the game? That's what happens, Bob?
I guess it's part of the game, but to be honest, I don't know that much about the content of these emails. Can you fill me in just very briefly?
These are emails where they were criticizing, the people in Oneida County were criticizing the economic development efforts of those in Herkimer County and made some pretty crude comments. Steve DeMaio said, maybe called one of them Einstein with a sarcastic tone. And it has been taken very, very, well, let's just say the people in Herkimer County not very happy. Certainly, this was not the intention of the foil, but this is what ended up coming out of it.
So are we talking about communications made by members of the public that were critical of people in government?
Just these are people in government that made comments about people in government in a neighboring county.
Okay, so we're talking about communications between or among government officials. Is that right?
Correct,
yes. Yeah. Okay. Let me put this in perspective, if I may. Many of your listeners know that the Freedom of Information Law is based upon a presumption of openness. All government records are supposed to be public unless records or portions of records fall within an exception listed in the law, and the exceptions basically are intended to prevent some sort of harm. In this instance, where we're talking about communications between or among people in government, one of the exceptions, it deals with so-called interagency and intra-agency materials, has been interpreted by the state's highest court to enable the government to withhold portions that consist of advice, opinion, suggestion, recommendation, things like that. So if I write to somebody at Herkimer County, in Herkimer County government, I'm at the Department of State, an agency, Herkimer County is an agency, and I say, I think that you ought to do this. The I think is my recommendation. It can be withheld. But the same provision also says that other aspects of those communications are public, most significantly, in most cases, statistical or factual information. And the courts have said that means numbers that may appear in rows. It may be a narrative expression of fact. I drove to work this morning, and it was raining. That's a fact. That portion would be public. So again, if I write to the official and I say, I think we should do such and such, so be it. That can be withheld. But if I'm smart, gee, I'm going to back up the I think with something, and usually the something will be facts.
You know, so take this comment. I'd like to pull, if I can find where the email is. Hold on. I want to read just, they're talking about the pumpkin patch, which is a place that is developed. Herkimer County is useless. This comes from Steve DeMaio. They have no plan, no strategy, and do not know how to put projects together. What's interesting is has nothing to do with the hospital at all. And it was a no hospital group that was questioning economic development with the hospital project. Could they have redacted that line?
They could have, but the question is, why would they? You know, certainly if so-and-so says such and such is useless, that's an opinion. Right. That's an opinion. There's no doubt that that could be withheld. But at the same time, Freedom of Information Law is permissive. It says that we may withhold in certain circumstances, but it doesn't say that we must.
This brings to me the question. There are things that were redacted in this. I can't for the life of me figure out, because knowing that this is going to cause a real problem between the two counties, why they wouldn't have redacted that email. I mean, I don't see any purpose of that email. Even has nothing to do with the hospital.
You know, I can't answer the question. Right. All I can suggest to you is that certainly the expressions of opinion or belief could be withheld. Facts would be public, but there would be no bar to disclosure. Yeah. And we all know that in some cases opinions are disclosed, maybe for the purpose of political gain, maybe for the purpose of embarrassment.
Yeah.
Bob, I want to ask you something that came up in our discussion about these emails. Kind of surprised me. I'd like to know if it's true or not. We found out about these emails. This No Hospital Downtown group foiled the emails. Now, these emails involve the Oneida County Executive's office and correspondence with his staff to an economic development agency and a state assemblyman. When asked about any emails the state assemblyman might have,
this is really interesting.
We were told that the state law on open government, or the FOIL law, I don't know how to exactly word that.
The Senate and Assembly.
The Senate and Assembly, basically, they would not have to disclose their emails on a project like this.
Their emails are exempt from foiling.
Yet Oneida counties were not.
Let me again put this in perspective. FOIL applies generally to agencies. An agency is a state agency, unit of local government, a school district, a public authority. State legislature is not an agency. So it is excluded from that definition and the general provisions of FOIL. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, FOIL basically says that agency records are available with certain exceptions. FOIL does apply to the state legislature, but differently. Instead of saying everything is available except, there is a list of accessible records from the Senate and the Assembly, and unless you can squeeze your request into one of those categories of available records, there are no rights. So the reality is that the state legislature operates under a different standard than the rest of government. Now, for what it's worth, we've been pushing, and there's an element of the governor's budget bill which would bring the state legislature under the same standards as the rest of government. But if we're talking about internal emails involving members of the Senate or the Assembly and their staffs, yes, they could be withheld, but for the same token, if the governor sends an email or receives an email from a staff person and the staff person is offering advice, that too could be withheld. You know, I'm not sure that the outcome is necessarily so different in every instance, but it is true that the state legislature is treated differently than the rest of government.
It's very interesting. That is
and how does the county executive's office, that's considered an agency?
You betcha.
Okay.
You betcha. You know, the law defines agency to include virtually every entity of government in New York except the state legislature and the judiciary, which is the courts. And the courts are not covered by FOIL, but there are any number of other provisions of law that generally require that court records be disclosed.
I noticed when you first talked about the fact that the legislature's emails are not FOILable, you made a statement which was actually just a syllable, and I'm not sure it was a word. You said, what is that? What is that?
I say a lot.
Yeah, and that means, isn't that coincidental? Are you surprised the legislature has been able to position this so that their emails are not foilable?
Well, you know, it's not a surprise to me because the provisions that we're talking about have been on the books since 1978. And in fact, you may know that we submit reports to the governor and the legislature annually. You know, we've suggested that the state legislature be subject to the same standards as others for 1,000 years or so, it seems. But the blanket statement that the emails are not public is not necessarily true. Again, the content would determine what's public and what's not. If there's an email that deals with a bill and there are statistics and facts within that email relating to the bill, which is public, that would be available. That would be available. So I wouldn't want to suggest to you that the legislature has a blanket capacity to withhold all emails.
Okay.
Do agencies, for instance, a county executive's office or a county commissioner's office, do they have the ability to reach out to you and say, hey, we got a FOIL request. Do we have to disclose X, Y, and Z?
It's interesting that you ask. We receive thousands of inquiries every year. We get more from local government officials than any other group, number one. And number two, next Monday, I'll be speaking at the annual conference of the New York State Association of Counties. So, yes, they do reach out. They do ask questions. We do provide training. We have, I think, a very good relationship with local governments and local government organizations.
Which I think at one point, Tony Pacenti is or was, I think, chairman of that, of NISAC. I could be right. But let me ask you this, Bob. What is the penalty for a government agency that receives a FOIL request but does not disclose? Basically, they hide or conceal something that should be made public.
Or they delay it.
Is there a penalty?
And my answer would have been different a couple of weeks ago than it is today. FOIL was amended. The governor signed a bill, which, again, was based upon a recommendation that we had made, which deals with denials of access by the government. Now, if the government had a good reason but couldn't meet the burden of proof, couldn't meet the burden of defending secrecy, a court in all likelihood would simply let the record go, and that would be the end of it. But if a court finds that the agency had no reasonable basis for withholding the record, under this new provision, there would be a mandatory award of attorney's fees made to John or Jane Q. Public, the person who brought the lawsuit. Now, the intent of that legislation clearly is not to sting the government, but rather to encourage the government to comply with law.
It's always interesting to speak with you, Bob. You know more about this than anybody. You've been doing it for a long time.
I've been doing it. Mark and I have talked about this, actually. Mark Butler and I, we're both, what's the word, old. I'm older than he is, and I've been at this for an awfully long time, and I think I have the best job in state government.
Well, you might have been working with Mark when he was a young reporter at the Observer-Dispatch.
Yes, I did.
Yeah. All right,
yes,
Bob.
I did.
Bob Freeman is the Executive Director of New York State Committee on Open Government. Thank you so much for taking the time.